Well, let's begin, and let's just have a half minute or so of silence as we begin this session. Thank you. Well, good morning and welcome to the first of 4 programs for the forum. Remember, we are now calling our work on Sunday mornings after church the forum rather than the adult forum. Today, the Reverend Dr. Jim Trainor is going to address the intersections between science and spirituality. In mid-October, Dr. Charles Franklin of the Marquette University Law School will share the latest polling trends for the state of Wisconsin. And Jean Heffernan in mid-November will facilitate a session on children with special needs. And Philip Chard is going to return to Christ Church on December 6th to address ways to accommodate life during the winter months in the midst of the pandemic. And our future sessions or future editions of the broadcast will give more detail on those presentations. And Father Jim and Father Seth and I are working on the forum sessions for winter spring. If you have some special interests, please let us know. For our session this morning, would you be so kind as to turn off your sound until after the presentation? And we'll take up questions then. I don't see that we have a place for you to type in questions. So just hold your questions until the end.
Bob?
And yes.
Excuse me. Down in that bar at the bottom, where it says, there's a little place that says chat.
Oh, yes.
If you click on that chat, a sidebar will open up on the right-hand side and you can type in a question there.
Excellent. Thank you. After Jim's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. Father Jim Trainor is a Renaissance man. Can't say that loud enough, long enough, deeply enough. He has a career in physics with a Ph.D. in physics from the University of California. He is an ordained Episcopal priest. He served as deputy director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He served as a pastor of 3 churches and is the author of 6 books. They're amazing. And one of his books is entitled Grasp, Making Sense of Science and Spirituality. And last week, I finished reading one of his novels called The Mountain Goat. I can tell you it is an addictive story of the travel adventures of a young couple in our country's Northwest. That's all I'll tell you now. It is amazing. I think you'll love it. Jim's wife, Mary, is also an Episcopal priest, and both are new members of Christ Church. This morning, Father Jim will discuss the intersection between science and religious faith. He will take up questions like, are science and religious faith in conflict? Are scientific findings relentlessly eroding away the beliefs of our faith tradition? Do scientists believe in God? Jim, a hearty welcome, and thank you for sharing your time and insights with us.
Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, everybody. It's good to see everybody. It's always feels so good to be together on a Sunday morning, and what a beautiful service that was today. Just for us at home to see just the beautiful interior of our church, and it seems like the music was exceptional today, especially that violin solo at the beginning. It just blew me away. And then Father Seth's comforting guidance about how we deal with these times of anxiety. I really greatly valued that. So great morning. I'm glad to be here. So yeah, I worked as a professional physicist for over 20 years, and I sought my answers for many things in the laws and scientific processes of physics. And physics, it seeks to identify the relationships between matter and energy that underpin all the other natural sciences like biology, chemistry, geology, and so on. And over a 20-year period there, I was privileged to serve with some of the brightest scientists in some of the premier science institutions in the world. I feel really blessed by that. I had the opportunity to work on cutting-edge research programs, to test theories with state-of-the-art experiments, to argue through ideas at international conferences and publish results in some of the best science journals. I've pulled my share of all-nighters collecting data in the lab, and I know the frustration of an experiment that fails after a lot of hard work. And let me tell you, most physics experiments are like that. They fail and they're frustrating, and it takes a lot of do-overs to finally get things right. But I have occasionally experienced that euphoric feeling of an experiment that succeeds, and all of a sudden it shines new light into our basic understanding of physical reality. So working as a physicist is, for me, was tough, it was hard, it was exciting, and it was utterly a blast. So maybe you can imagine the raised eyebrows I encountered when I told my colleagues and my friends that I would leave experimental physics research to study theology and become an Episcopal priest. How could you possibly do that? It was a typical kind of a question. Those two things certainly don't seem related to each other. Underlying such comments, I believe, was a deeper question. And that is, how could someone grounded in modern scientific principles and practices possibly become fascinated with something so ancient and mysterious and soft and unprovable as religion? As if modern science and spirituality are somehow in conflict, and you've got to choose one over the other. I do believe, and many scientists agree with me, that science and religious faith are not in conflict, even though from the very beginning, people have been suspicious that they are. When Galileo invented the telescope, there were church leaders who forbid their parishioners from looking through it, afraid that what they might see through that new telescope might undercut some of the things the church had been teaching them. On the other hand, I recall talking to a man one day and inviting him to come to church. Excuse me. And he said, "Oh, no, I could never do that." He says, "Because you see, I believe in evolution," as if somehow these things are in conflict. Bottom line here for me is, I have seen no modern science discoveries that contradict or replace the foundations of our faith, creating, redeeming, and sustaining God. So today I'm going to be talking about science and faith, as the title says, but my perspective, I must confess, comes as a physicist and as a Christian. So maybe a better title would be Physics and Christianity. But what I'm going to say, actually, I want to put that caveat out to the very beginning, applies just as well to the other branches of the natural sciences and to any of the, I think, of the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Islam. So let me try to get the screen share here to work. And we'll begin. So this is a real old picture. You can tell by my lack of gray hair that this is in a laboratory, a big facility that I was working with back at Los Alamos National Lab with one of my former colleagues there. Peter is his name. And that's the kind of world I lived in for a long time. And that's where all those questions arose as I departed to become a priest. And for the last 20 years that I've been a priest, I've still been thinking about that relation between science and religious faith. And I wrote a book about it, as Bob mentioned, and I'll point that out and point you to it at the end if anybody wants to take a look at it. But today I want to say it's a huge topic. I want to just share a few thoughts and share some of the thoughts of other people. I'm mainly going to be speaking from the point of view of scientists today. So I will hear what some of them have to say and then some of my own thoughts. So today we're going to be looking in this topic of science and faith a little bit, brushing across 3 myths. And they are, as Bob pointed out at the beginning, the idea that scientific progress is somehow eroding the province of faith. That is, as science produces more and more understanding of physical reality, learns more and more about the universe we live in, that slowly and slowly the need for faith to explain things in our lives is diminishing. So that's one myth. Scientists are usually atheists. That's a commonly held belief. Well, we'll see about that. And that there is an inherent conflict between science and religious faith. I don't think that's true at all. And one other scientist says that religious faith and science are like cousins seeking the same truths. I want to say right offhand that none of these things I believe are true, although there are people who would disagree with me. It's a very big and diverse topic that we're dealing with. But let's dig in. This book, which many of you have seen, many of you probably own, and maybe a few of you have read, is kind of what kicked off the modern dialogue between science and faith, I believe. A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. It doesn't talk about faith topics in the book, but it explored some of the new concepts in physics that really got people thinking about spirituality more. Topics like the Big Bang, the anthropic principle, black holes, and string theory, things like that. And we'll touch on a few of those things as we tour through this stuff this morning. It was a huge selling book, sold over 20 million copies. Some people have called it the best-selling book that nobody has ever read because it's very hard to read. It's a very hard book, even though it's nominally written for lay people. I read it 3 times, and it was only kind of on the 3rd time that I really began to understand this book. I dispute that term, though, the best-selling book that nobody ever read, because I think that's the Bible. Nonetheless, here we go. Here's a comment that Stephen Hawking makes in the book that I think relates to what we're going to be talking about today. He says, we find ourselves in a bewildering world. We want to make sense out of what we see around us and to ask, what is the nature of the universe? What is our place in it? And where did it and we come from? Why is it the way it is? Well, those questions he asks are posed as scientific questions. But if you look at them, they're also theological questions, aren't they? So that's interesting. Also, the statement he says, we find ourselves in a bewildering world. For a modern scientist to say that is an astounding thing. Let's look a little deeper into that. At the beginning of the 20th century, no scientist or follower of science would have said, we find ourselves in a bewildering world. Because the understanding in those days, the beginning of the 20th century, was that physics and science had everything pretty well explained. We had the classical laws of physics, and that pretty well explained everything that we needed to know about physical reality. And that was the beginning of this idea that the growth in physics was gradually eroding the province of religious faith. But that is no longer true. And in fact, the 19th century certainty has been replaced by a 21st century uncertainty and awe. At the beginning of the 20th century, a scientist might have said, isn't it amazing and beautiful how elegant and explainable the universe is? At the beginning of the 21st century, a scientist might say, isn't it beautiful and amazing how bizarre and incomprehensible the universe is? Let's just take a look at some of those reasons why that is true. First of all, we cannot grasp, just you and I, we can put numbers on it, but we really can't grasp how large or how small the universe actually is. Now, I'm not going to have time to talk about how small it is, but I want to give you a little illustration about how large the known universe is. The radius today of the universe is believed to be about 40 billion light years in diameter. If the universe were a sphere, actually it's supposed to be more flat or some other geometry. But let's just try to understand how big that is. Let's say you and I wanted to build a spaceship to travel to the edge of the universe, or to travel about 40 billion light years away, well, we'd need a ship that went really fast, wouldn't we? Modern airliners could travel around the Earth in about 48 hours. Our best space probes can travel around the Earth in about 1 hour. Well, a ship like that is not going to be nearly fast enough for what we need to travel to the edge of the universe. So what if we had a ship that traveled around the Earth in 1 minute? That's pretty fast. But no, that's not nearly fast enough. What if we had a ship that could travel around the Earth in 1 second? Now that's really honking. Can you imagine traveling around the whole circumference of the Earth in 1 second? But I'll tell you what, down at Joe's used spaceship lot, he's running a deal this weekend on used spaceships. And he's got a model there that he promises will go travel around the Earth 8 times in a second. That's the one we want. So now that we've got our spaceship, let's try to put together a crew that's going to operate this ship for traveling to the edge of the universe. It's going to be a big trip. There's no question about it. So we're going to need a big crew. So I propose that we select the entire populations of the upper Midwest. Let's invite all the people from Wisconsin, and Illinois, and Minnesota, and Michigan to be our crew. So that's 25 or 30 million people. And so it's going to be a huge trip, and there's going to be a lot of people, but we'll be entertained along the way because we'll get to over and over again be able to watch the Green Bay Packers beat up on the Vikings and the Bears and the Lions. So that should be fun. So a question now is, we have this ship that'll travel so fast, it's like going around the Earth 8 times in 1 second, and we have a crew of 30 million people. And being an equal opportunity employer, we want to give each person the same amount of time at the helm of the ship, at the controls. The question is, how is that progressing? And how long would each person be at the controls? So let's assume that the ship took off, and the first person took his or her turn at the controls 2,000 years ago, at the time that Jesus was born. How's that working out? Well, today, that first person would still have about 1,000 years to go before turning over the controls to the second person. And only after all 30 million people had had a chance at the controls would we be arriving at the edge of the universe. We can't really grasp how big the physical universe is. Another amazing 20th century discovery is that 96% of the matter and energy in our universe is unaccounted for. You know, we can look out at into the universe with all kinds of probes, and we can measure the matter, the conventional matter that's made up of protons and neutrons, and the energy, the light, and the radiation that's emitted from warm objects. And we can see all those things, but all of that accounts for only about 4% of the matter and energy in the universe that must be there. We know it must be there because we know that the universe is expanding at a certain rate, and in fact, it's speeding up, it's accelerating in its expansion. And that requires a certain amount of matter and energy to be there. 96% of it is unknown. We don't know what it is or where it is. That's an open question in physics. There may be as many as 11 physical dimensions. And that is a result of a thing called string theory, which is one of the best modern theoretical physics theories for explaining physical reality. It's an attempt to reconcile the big workhorses of the 20th century, general relativity and quantum mechanics. And one of the predictions is that there are 11 physical dimensions, instead of the normal 3 that we know of, you know, forward and backwards, up and down, sideways. But there are 11. Where are they? Nobody knows. There's a thing called the anthropic principle. I don't know how many of you have heard of that. Anthropic, of course, comes from a word that means of humanity, of human beings. And this is a collection of findings and realizations that occurred starting in the late 1970s and continuing today, from attempts to mathematically and using physics models to model the explosion we know as the Big Bang. one of the data points that a successful model of the Big Bang must contain is to account for at least one place in this universe of a place that could give rise to carbon-based life like our Earth. In order to do that, you put in the various constants that we know of. There's about 15 of them, like the strength of gravity, the strength of the attraction between charged particles like electrons and protons in an atom, and many others. And what is found is that if you put in the known constants, you can predict the clustering of galaxies, the condensation and the production of heavier elements out of helium and hydrogen, and the formation of a planet like ours. If you tweak the values of those constants just a little bit, even less than 1%, it's impossible for this Earth to come into being. It's an astounding thing. As somebody has said, it can't be just a coincidence. And if it's a coincidence, it's sort of like winning the Powerball lottery 100 times in a row. Even agnostics like Stephen Hawking have said about the anthropic principle, it would seem like we are meant to be here. And then we are beginning to believe that there may be parallel universes, additional universes in addition to our vast universe, maybe an infinite number even. So there is some of the jaw-dropping facts that we have discovered in the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. What do we make of all of that? What do scientists think about that? Well, here is a guy named Alan Guth. He's a professor of physics at MIT, and he's one of the important leaders in understanding the theory of the Big Bang. And by the way, pay attention to those equations on the blackboard in the back there, because there will be a quiz at the end of this talk. Anyway, Guth says, if we were to make up the laws of the universe, that universe would be much more dull than the one we actually see around us. So a question in this newfound mystery of the late 20th century and up to the now, is there room for a God in the mystery of the universe? Well, while we ponder that, let's ask ourselves, what do scientists think about this question? How do they respond to the idea, the question, is there a God? Well, let's take a look at three scientists, very noteworthy scientists. The first one is Richard Dawkins, who many of you have heard of. He is a world-famous geneticist and cell biologist from Oxford, and he's well-known mainly because he's an atheist, and a very outspoken atheist. He wrote a book called The God Delusion, which we may say a little bit more later on if there's time. He says about, is there a God? He says, God, though technically not disprovable, is very, very improbable indeed. We'll say a little bit more about that later. Here's another guy that's in the news, and you've probably seen him on TV recently, Francis Collins. He is the director of the National Institutes of Health. He's Anthony Fauci's boss, and he is a real luminary of a scientist. He's both an MD and has a Ph.D. in chemistry. His research has isolated the genes that are responsible for very awful diseases like cystic fibrosis and Huntington's chorea, I believe. And he's done a lot of great work. He's also written a book that I would encourage you to take a look at called The Language of God. Talks about his own faith and also talks about the intersection of modern science and faith, and especially the theory of evolution. He has a lot to say about that that's very important. He says, I believe that Jesus was resurrected in physical form and seen by witnesses whom he spoke to before he then ascended. That is the absolute cornerstone of the Christian faith. And I selected this quote mainly because it was done in an interview with Steve Paulson, who is a local guy from Wisconsin Public Radio. And so you can also find the whole article that contains this quote in Salon magazine, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Finally, here is John Polkinghorne. one of my heroes. He is a theoretical particle physicist from Cambridge University. He is a former president of Queen's College, Cambridge. He occupied the same university seat that Stephen Hawking held, the same chair that Stephen Hawking held at the university, and is also an Anglican priest. He's retired now. In fact, I believe in a couple of weeks, John Polkinghorne will be celebrating his 90th birthday. I'm very jealous because Ed Liddell tells me he actually got to have lunch with John Polkinghorne once. So maybe he could share when he gets back from his trip sometime some of those experiences. Here's what Polkinghorne says. Polkinghorne's written many, many books on the intersection of faith and science, and probably the world's expert on that, I would say. He says this: "The center of my faith lies in my encounter with the figure of Jesus Christ as I meet him in the Gospels, in the witness of the church, and in the sacraments. Yet at a supportive level, there are also hints of God's presence which arise from our scientific knowledge." This is a huge statement here, and one we could spend a lot of time unpacking. But I want to point out the main thing here. Here is this luminarious priest and theoretical particle physicist who has a tremendous grasp on reality. And how does he come to faith? He comes to faith through his encounter with Christ as he meets him in the Gospels, that is Holy Scripture, in the witness of the church, and in the sacrament. He has the same resources that you and I have in his faith journey. Very, very important. So let's look more generally. The scientists believe in God. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit of data here. So hold on to your hats just for a few minutes. I'm going to make this quick, but it's important to present some of these numbers. In the United States, in the general public, about 60% of the population would say they believe in God. And that's a very general number. It doesn't take into account differences in gender or ethnicity or demographics or education or things like that. There is a much more, this is part of a very detailed study from the Pew Research Center. So you might want to look at that. There's a lot of interesting data in there. Well, here's another study, the AAAS, American Academy for the Advancement of Science. It's the world's largest scientific organization. Their study of their scientists is 51% of scientists believe in God or a higher power. Well, that's less than 60, but it's in the ballpark. Over half of the scientists in the AAAS believe in God. And here's another study of over 1,000 US professors in the natural sciences, and 52% of them believe in God or a higher power. So, yeah, scientists do believe in God. Let me just tell you a story about when I was back at Los Alamos. I was in a large physics group. After I'd stepped down from being a deputy director for physics, I'd stepped down because I was beginning my theology studies to become an Episcopal priest. And I was working in this group, which is a very interesting group because the leader of the group was an ordained Jewish rabbi. And the deputy group leader of that group was a man who had gotten a seminary degree to become a Roman Catholic priest, although he had eventually decided to become a physicist. And you can imagine the three of us had some very interesting conversations. So we decided that once a week we would bring our brown bag lunches into the big conference room, a whole 50 people or so down the hall from our offices, and we just sit around the table and talk about some of the big questions about God. About, you know, how scientists believe in God? What are some of the questions of our faith, and so on? Just the three of us. We didn't invite any other people to come in. We were working for a government laboratory, so we had to be careful about that. But we left the doors open. And people would walk by and they'd poke their heads in and say, what are they doing in there? There was a great interest in our conversations. In a month of our weekly meetings, after a month, there were 40 to 50 people who would join us every week for those conversations, bringing their own brown bag lunches. People are hungry to talk about God, and even scientists. I've thought more recently, what an opportunity to start a church. It would have been a very interesting church, but that never quite happened. So if belief in God is a science question, then why isn't there unanimity in science's answers? Well, I'm going to stop the screen share for just a moment and talk about that. The answer is, if you asked a scientist whether or not how they feel about the law of gravity, there would be almost 100% unanimity in agreeing about the parameters of that. But it's not so with issues of faith. And the reason for that is, let me just read you a quote. This is from Alistair McGrath, who is a science and theologian from Oxford University, another one of these important guys. I don't have time to talk about him this morning, but he states that most unbelieving scientists of my acquaintance are atheists on grounds other than their science. They bring their assumptions to their science rather than basing them on their science. That's true for believers as well, I think. So let me address that just a moment. We saw how John Polkinghorne, how he came to faith, even though he says there are hints in the scientific world of God's existence. He came through it by being in the church, through hearing the gospel, through experiencing the sacraments and the witness of the church. What about Francis Collins? In his book, The Language of God, he talks about this in a very moving story. He was a young doctor in a big hospital back east, and he believed he was an atheist, but he didn't really have any convictions one way or the other about it. He was making his rounds at a time, and he would visit this elderly woman who was near death and from cancer, and he was amazed at how cheerful she always was when he went in and saw her. And one day he asked her, he says, "Why are you so able to be so cheerful in your situation?" And she shared with him that it was because she believed in God. And that kind of put him back on his heels. And then she looked at him and she said, "Doctor, you don't look very happy. What is it that you believe?" And he was silent because he couldn't come up with an answer, because he really didn't believe in anything. And that got him started in a quest to understand more. He went out and started reading some books. He mentions that he read A Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and he was chewing on all of these things. And a couple months later, he was on a hike up in the Pacific Northwest, he said, and then he came around a trail, on the corner of a trail, and he saw a big glacier up ahead and these frozen waterfalls pouring out of the glacier into the canyon below. And all of a sudden, he was struck by just the beauty, and he knew that God existed. He said he fell to his knees and prayed right there. And so that's how Francis Collins came to be a believer. It also points out something very important, the importance of our own witnesses. This woman who was dying in the hospital shared her faith with Francis Collins, and look what a profound effect that had. That should be an encouragement, I would think, for all of us. Richard Dawkins, the atheist, he does not talk about how he became an atheist in his book, The God Delusion. However, far back in the book, if you read all the way through, back on page 350 something or other, he mentions very briefly that he grew up in a Catholic school, and when he was a preteen, he was sexually abused by a Catholic priest. He says, well, that didn't affect my beliefs about God. And maybe it did, I don't know, but I do wonder. I mean, a tragic, horrible thing. But anyway, that's what Alistair McGrath tells us, that scientists, just like the rest of us, probably don't come to faith through something that they've learned in their science, but through other things. I'm going to go back to this. Philosopher Esther Meek says, summarizing what I just said, the person who knows God would rightly feel it inappropriate to say that their knowledge of him rests on a reasoned argument. So what about me? How did I become a believer? What I was actually asked that. It's amazing how we may be people of faith, but we actually sometimes don't even think about some of these things, about how did I come to be who I am and what I am, until somebody actually asks you a penetrating question like that. I was giving a talk on science and religion. Actually, it was over at St. John's on the lake 3 or 4 years ago. And one of the people in there after my talk said, well, so how did you become a believer? And implied that maybe there were some important scientific studies that I had been influenced by that helped me become a believer in God. And I'd never been asked that before. And I just blurted out. I said, I became a believer because I saw the tears in my mother's eyes when she sang Rock of Ages to me when I was 5 years old. And that was profoundly true. So let's turn to the question of what do you know? If we're going to talk about the intersection of faith and science, we need to talk about what do we know and how do we know it. These are huge topics and we don't have time to go into them. My book, Grasp, talks about them in some more detail, but we can talk briefly about what do you know? How do we know things? So I want to put up a chart here. Let's assume this entire black space on your computer screen is the whole realm of knowledge of things that we know, are the things that we could know, things that are knowable. Down here in the middle, and I've shown this little circle of this is what we actually know. We know how to create a smallpox vaccine. We know our social security number. We know how many games the Brewers have won this year. Not very many, by the way. And I've got little arrows shooting out from this circle because that is growing every day, the amount that we know. And it's expanding into a regime of what we know that we don't know. Things where we have active questions of things we're trying to learn, like, can we develop a successful and effective vaccine for COVID-19? That's something we're working on. We're trying to learn that. And maybe questions about how do we test the latest theories of physics. We have personal questions like that too, don't we, that we're asking. How do I plan for my retirement? That region is surrounded by another region of all that is knowable, what we don't know, but we may be able to learn. But so far, we don't even know how to ask questions about it. Here's an example. 40 or 50 years ago, we could not ask a question about the internet because we didn't even know what the internet was or what the concept was or how to ask a question about such a thing. But today we, of course, understand it. Today it's down in this what do we know circle. But 50 years ago, it was not. So there is a realm out there of all that is knowable, what we may be able to learn someday, but we don't even know how to ask about yet. This also raises another question. Is there a limit to human knowledge? Well, we don't know the answer to that, do we? Is there a limit to human knowledge? But is there a limit beyond, no matter how big our supercomputers become, no matter how good our understanding of science, no matter how many smart kids we have going to college, that we're just not going to be able to learn more? Is there such a limit? I don't know. But while we're pondering that, I want to tell you about my dog, Barnabas. Barnabas, God rest his soul, was a golden retriever, and he was one of the smartest dogs I've ever known. In fact, in some ways, I think Barnabas was smarter than me. But I want you to know that despite my best efforts, I never was able to teach Barnabas trigonometry. He just couldn't get it. Barnabas couldn't understand the difference between a tangent and a tangerine. And if Barnabas, who was smarter than me in some ways, couldn't grasp trigonometry because it was just beyond his capacity to learn, are there such things for us? Is there something that will be potentially unknowable by us? And maybe some of the questions that we ponder, questions of our faith, maybe some of those lie out there as well in these regimes beyond what we know. One of the dangers is that, but it's a temptation as well, is that we attempt to explain things about our faith, about God, based on what we know. That's what Richard Dawkins does when he says that the existence of God is very highly improbable. He's coming from this range of what do we know. It's limiting, and maybe sometimes it's the best we can do if we're talking about objective knowledge. That's why science doesn't necessarily inform faith very well. Although sometimes people of faith take new findings in science and extrapolate them to try to explain things of God, and that can be dangerous. For example, one might say, what about those 11 dimensions that string theory predicts, those 8 dimensions that are mysterious and we don't know where they are? Maybe that's how God moves around the universe. Maybe that's how God can move in time. Maybe that's how God can be everywhere at once. Maybe that's how prayer works. Maybe. But that's a dangerous thing. Let me show you some examples of why that's dangerous. Here is an edict from Pope Pius XII in 1952, following some of the discoveries of the Big Bang that showed that time and space came into being about 14 billion years ago in an instant, just sprang into being. This edict, and it may be true, it says science has provided proof of the beginning of time. Hence, creation took place in time. Therefore, there is a creator. Therefore, God exists. And it may be true. I don't know. But you see what has been done here? This is basing an argument for a creator, God, basing it on what current science says. And which is very possible if our understanding of the Big Bang evolves and changes in the years ahead, and it well may, that may totally negate this conclusion that God exists. Let me show you another example. The view that the Earth is not the center of the universe is philosophically false and at least erroneous in belief. This also came out of the Catholic Church in 1615. Of course, that was proved wrong by Galileo, who went to prison for having to speak out the truth, and it has caused centuries of embarrassment and backpedaling for the Church. Thomas Aquinas summed it up pretty well. He said, bad arguments for God's existence do more harm than good, since they give unbelievers an occasion to laugh. So how do we know about God? Let's go back to this circle here, where this is what we know here, and this out here somewhere beyond that. I don't know about where these regimes it lies, but these define things, knowing God and knowing about God. There are things that we can know based on what we already know. We can know about God. That's a field that's called natural theology, based on our observations of beauty, of the existence of morality, of some of the scientific findings like the anthropic principle that I mentioned a little bit earlier. But what we need to do, what works better, is a different type of knowledge. And that knowledge is pointed out in that chart I showed you from John Polkinghorne about he has come to know Jesus Christ. And that is through study of Scripture. I don't know if you can see that here. Scripture read faithfully in his encounter of Jesus in the Gospels. And I want to say that this is read as a faithful experiential process. I've always want to emphasize to people when we study the Bible, we have to do it prayerfully, praying for the guidance of the Holy Spirit. I remember the first time I read the book of Acts, all these different names and places and sermons and people. It was like reading the telephone book from Manhattan. But then I went back and read it again. And this time I prayed to the Holy Spirit, please open up these words to me. Help me to understand what's going on. And that scripture just came alive. So that's one avenue for making contact beyond what we know objectively. Witness of the church, and that Polkinghorne mentions, that includes the witness of the saints, the traditions of our church, hearing from other believers, like Francis Collins heard from that woman in the hospital bed, like my mother singing Rock of Ages to me. We're still not necessarily with these things going to ever explain some of these things like miracles, eternal life, the Holy Spirit. How does prayer work? Maybe we won't ever understand those. Remember, St. Paul says that as we try to grasp God, it's like we're looking through an old mirror. We see in a mirror dimly when we're trying to see these. But he says that someday we'll see him face to face. And then finally, the sacraments. This promise of the real physical touch of God's grace in the sacraments. These ways of knowing and are experiential ways of knowing, where we kind of engage the problem rather than studying it from the outside. It's called relational knowing or personal knowing. There's a whole field of this area, a part of a bigger field called epistemology. That's in my book. I don't have time to talk about it, but it is where we learn by experiencing and hanging out and engaging the problem rather than studying it from afar. It's important in physics too. The whole idea of mentoring. You go to graduate school and research, and Shell and I were talking about that earlier, about how our experiences in graduate school. An important factor in that is working with a mentor who you work side by side with, and they teach you objective things, but also just being there, you pick up things, and that's what's going on here. Scientists use that all the time. That's where the hypotheses for the scientific method comes from, where you get those hunches, those inspirations, the thinking out of the box that help form the hypotheses for the scientific method. So we can talk more about that when we get to the end. I know it's hard to explain because this is a hard topic to explain, but I think we've all experienced that this morning, have we not? In listening to that beautiful music, seeing the interior of our beautiful church, engaging and letting the words of Father Sept and that sermon just kind of flow into us. It's an engaging kind of knowledge. This guy, Richard Feynman, won the Nobel Prize in Physics. He's one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century. And he's holding a rubber O-ring. And maybe you remember him being in the news because it was Feynman who discovered and explained the faulty O-ring that caused the tragic Challenger accident. He says, and Feynman, by the way, I got to meet him one time. He's an amazing guy. He's one of the greatest teachers of physics. I would like to talk about him some more sometimes. Amazingly inspirational person. He says this. He says, scientists take all those things that can be analyzed by observation, and thus the things called science are found out. That's what happens in that little circle of the things we know, the things we find out by direct observation, objective study. Then he says, but there are some things left out for which the method does not work. This does not mean that those things are unimportant. They are, in fact, in many ways, the most important. So what might he be talking about? As we ponder what some of those things might be, let's drop into the high school cafeteria. It's lunch hour, and here is a TJ, who might be called a slacker. He's kind of one of the marginal students, and he's got his tray of food, and he's coming to sit with Gunther, who is kind of the class nerd. And he sees Gunther sitting there working away, and he says, what you doing, Gunther? Why you doing homework, Gunther? It's lunchtime. This isn't homework. I'm calculating who to ask to the prom, Luann or Bernice. You see, by plotting comparison evaluation charts to specify the relative plus-minus aspects of each candidate, then factoring out the equivalents, I'll find who has the optimum qualities. Whoa, you are Mr. Romance. Romance. I forgot to put that on the charts. The things that may be important but not understandable by the scientific method. Romance, maybe love, maybe faith. It's mysterious, our faith is. Here's some words by this guy who you know. We're almost to the end here. I don't know how long we've been going, but probably long enough. He says, the most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mysterious. It is the most fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as death, a snuffed out candle. Both art and science depend on embracing the mysterious. I'm going to close with here just a picture that explains one more reason I believe in God. This is my granddaughter, Isla, taken about a year ago when she was 2. you can't look into the eyes of a little child like that and not know that something special and holy and divine is going on. So that's the end of my talk. I want to point out, I did write a book called Grasp, Making Sense of Science and Spirituality. You can get it at Amazon if you're interested, or you can find out more about it on my website. Also, if you want to receive copies of today's slides so you can study them in more detail, send me an email at my email address, trainors3@gmail.com, or you can find it in the Christchurch directory, and I'll send you a copy of today's slides. So that is the end. So Bob, if there's some questions that folks have, or anybody wants to make a comment or ask some questions, I'm willing to engage them.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Everyone, please feel free to put your activate your voice feature. And I would like to ask you, as we get into Q&A, if you'll just raise your hand, and I'll call on you and we'll go forward with the Q&A. Who has the first question for Jim? John, go ahead.
I learned just yesterday about and of course I must have learned it in school, about the Council of Trent, where the Roman Catholic Church, the church at the time, separated science and spirituality, and said spirituality and consciousness and things that are unknowable belong to us. They're the realms of the church, and science belongs to the lay, and the two are separate. And I wonder, it seems to me that that's sort of the groundwork of where this conflict between science and religion, or science and spirituality, came. Am I wrong on that? Is the Council of Trent not that important?
No, I think it probably was important. I can't say that that's where it necessarily came from, but it does demonstrate the kind of fear that exists on both sides. As I mentioned at the outset, I've seen examples of people, religious people, who are afraid and distrustful of science because they are afraid that science is going to undercut their beliefs. But then there are also scientists who dismiss the findings of faith, and that just happens, and that's real, and I think that's institutionally occurred, and certainly has occurred in the Catholic Church, and maybe the Council of Trent had something to do with that.
Who has the next question?
While you're thinking about it, let me just say, I want to say something more about the God delusion. Got it right here. There's The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. It's a very famous book, and it's about this book about atheism. And I've read this book in great detail, and I will confess that I was actually afraid to read this book at one point, because here was this world famous geneticist who had studied all of these things. He studied the selfish gene. It was one of his discoveries. And he knew all these things about genetics. And I had this fear, and it relates to what John was bringing up, this fear that maybe he was going to say something scientifically that was going to undercut my faith. Well, I shouldn't have had that fear. I read the book, and he was, even though he's this great geneticist, his takedown of religious faith is very amateurish, and it's based on a lot of quotes from other people that are not, it's not scientific at all. It's based on anger and finger pointing and a lot of hand waving. It's quite a remarkable book from that standpoint. So it's not based on science at all. And I was afraid to read it, because I was almost as bad as those people who were afraid to look through Galileo's telescope. There was no reason to be afraid. Shell,
go ahead.
What I have found is that, or at least is from what I conclude based on what I've heard, is that people who say that science and religion are incompatible are basically approaching it from the standpoint of a literal translation of the Bible. In other words, if it's not literal, they take this literal reading as a physical reality truth instead of a metaphorical or spiritual reality. And therefore, obviously, based on the science of when the Bible, like the Old Testament and everything, all those stories are written, well, it was perfectly what I would call it a scientific understanding of its day. But science has moved on, and if you keep reading the Bible in terms of science from 1800 BC, of course, they're incompatible.
Yeah, you know, there was a good example, and there's some of the so-called young Earth creationists who want to stick to this idea that the Earth was created in 7 24-hour days, or 6 24-hour days, and that just doesn't stand up. You don't even have to be a scientist to question that. I mean, if you do, there was a guy named Bishop Ussher back in like the 1700s who added those 6 days to the ages given in the genealogies in the Old Testament, and then concluded that the Earth was at that time 6,000 years old or something like that. And the church, a lot of people in the church bought onto that, even though it doesn't make any kind of sense at all, because those days mentioned in Genesis, first of all, Genesis is not meant to be a science text, and those quote days, you know, I ask people, is God going to measure time in the universe based on the rotational velocity of the Earth? I mean, what a limited perspective from God. I mean, I can't believe it. And I think scholars in Hebrew will also say that those days mean eras of time. So a lot of that stuff is nonsense, and anybody who holds onto that is going to have to face the hard data from scientific data that shows that the universe really is about 14 billion years old. From several different ways we know that. So if you hold on to those kind of antiquated views, you're going to be in trouble. I don't know.
Hey, Jim, this is Oswald.
Yes, sir.
I came late. I was doing the communion, so I came at the end of your presentation. I'm not sure whether you talked about power and control as the fear that maybe the church might have, that if we let the science take over and explain everything, we might lose that control and the power, which is, I mean, to me, is not necessarily the case. But do you see that point whereby the church felt was, unless it has this mystery, something that does not go along with the science, that was the way of making sure they keep that power and control over the people, other than just letting science, explain things and try to show what's going on around the world as some scientific, something that can be explained by science, which to me, it doesn't make, it does not mean that God is not in that. But I guess some people might think of that as a way of losing that control and the power. Is that something that you talked about? I'm wondering, I'm not sure.
I talk about it this morning, but it's very much an important factor. I did show that quote from the Vatican in 1615. That time of the Galileo controversy, by the way, also is about the same time as the Protestant Reformation. So the church was feeling a lot of threatening activity going on in the world. There's a lot of hotbeds of resistance to the church's power and control during those times. So now a hotshot guy like Galileo stands up. I mean, normally the church might have just ignored him. They could have done that, but he was a very outspoken guy, had a lot of contacts. He was big friends with the Jesuit scientists and even in the Pope's own inner circles. But they couldn't be silent about that because they were afraid that their power might slip away. That was the kind of the behind the scenes motivation for their calling him into trial. And then since he actually didn't go to prison, he was put in house arrest for the rest of his life. So yes, power has always been a factor. I think there's power both ways in the church, but I think I think sometimes I've seen scientists who want to have a tunnel vision of fear that if I expand and I open my mind and my heart to what may be a greater realm of possibility and not just stick to my equations, there is a fear that I'm going to lose some of my power through that. So power and fear are often closely linked, aren't they? And I'm glad you brought that up, Father.
Go ahead.
I have just a quick question, and maybe this is off topic, but I'm wondering if you have any reaction to whether mystical experiences serve in the scientific world as any sort of evidence or empirical evidence for religion, or I should say for God, for a creator.
Yeah, I think mystical experiences have been important for a lot of people throughout history, and I think probably people in this group have had various kinds of mystical experience. These, I think, often are in that realm of knowledge out where we don't understand them very well, and so it's easy to dismiss them or saying, oh, I've never experienced anything like that, or science doesn't explain something like that, and so I can dismiss it, which is a dangerous thing to do. But I think such things are very real. I don't know, Susan, did that help answer your question?
Yeah, and it's maybe a whole topic for another day. I just wondered whether the area of science has looked into, the thing with the mystical experience is it's personal to one person. So for science then to try and study it on an evidentiary basis is probably difficult. I just wondered what your reaction was to that concept. So.
Well, yeah, and it's the same with the topic of miracles. And maybe a mystical experience is not unrelated to a miracle. We don't know what a miracle is, although we as Christians believe in the resurrection as an event that took place, and we may believe little different nuances about what happened in the resurrection, but we basically believe that happened. But it was a one-time event, and scientific method relies upon repeatability. Galileo dropping the cannonballs off the Leaning Tower of Pisa to measure how long it took him to fall to the earth. That relied upon the fact that kind of science is repeatable, and that's a necessary condition for the scientific method to work.
Others with questions?
Mine is a comment. I just want to mention about science. For me, the more scientific things become, the more, for me, the more I trust and believe in the science, because it seems like science is discovering that I think we know very little about the universe, about ourselves. There's so much more to discover, and if we take ourselves so seriously that we know everything, I think we are fooling ourselves. And I think the more we discover how immense the universe is, how little we know about reality, the more I find myself really trusting in God and the Supreme Being.
Absolutely. And I think it's exciting to be a scientist too. The psalmist says, great are the deeds of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them. That's Psalm 111, verse 2. And, I think that is the psalmist saying, we are to study, we are to explore, we are to learn about the reality, but also appreciate them through our faith in God and delight in them. And I think that enriches that enriches the joy of being a scientist. It has been my experience for sure.
Very good. Shell, do I see you wanting to ask a question or comment?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking of the comment by Einstein. I can't remember what was it, statistical mechanics or something other. Einstein said about some theory in quantum theory, some part of quantum theory said, God doesn't play dice with the universe or something to that effect.
Yes.
It was like his religious belief and concept of God did not lend itself to him, grasping or understanding or even accepting this part of physics, which, mathematics showed out. I mean, demonstrated, but he didn't believe it right away. I don't know how long it took him to accept it, or if he ever did, but it's interesting to see how a known physicist and mathematician could not accept something which all the other scientists did, and he was approaching science from a religious perspective.
Well, that's a good point, and thanks for bringing that up. And every scientist, even Einstein, has their limitations. He was talking about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and the basic probabilistic predictions of quantum mechanics there. And it is true that in his lifetime, Einstein never fully bought into quantum mechanics. It's a very hard thing to understand, but it is what is not that quote when Einstein said about the probabilistic predictions of quantum mechanics, God does not play dice with the universe. Heisenberg wrote back to him and said, even the great Einstein does not tell God what to do. I think that's a good response.
Jim, I can't help but think as I listen to your presentation about the trajectory of our coming to understand that there is some kind of relationship between science and spirituality. And for me, I began to think about such things in my early 20s. And I wonder, and maybe this is something you and I can talk about, or maybe it's the topic of another forum session. When do we introduce the big questions about the relationship between science and spirituality to young people? Do we need to become 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 before we're able to even think that there would be such a relationship? Any comment?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions like that. You make me think about a very contemporary example, a tragic one, between science and faith are the people who won't wear masks. Some of them who say that I'm going to trust God to protect me, so I don't need to wear a mask. And that's the science view, is that we need to wear masks so if we're going to beat this COVID thing. And that is a mistrust of science based on some kind of I think, an immature clinging to religious faith. That's kind of an example of not looking through the telescope.
Yeah, I've got a comment on that. When I hear that, I go back to the temptations of Christ, the story that the devil says, throw yourself off and God's angels will protect you.
Right.
And Jesus replies, it's written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. In other words, you're tempting God to point specific,
right.
Protect you. But, and another thing that was mentioned earlier, when I was at the University of Michigan, one of my friends was doing eye research at the medical school. And at one of our men's retreats, we got into the discussion of science and religion. And he said most people in his lab were religious people. And when they were asked about, well, how could they do these studies? And he said, well, it's simple. He said, we're just trying to figure out how God put the world together. And I always like that, because that's the role of science. If you accept God, then, as There's no limitations, and therefore our job is a puzzle that God put in front of us to figure out how the whole thing works. And that's why we're inquisitive. That's why we stand in awe of this mystery. It's like we see this puzzle in front of us, and we just got to figure out how it works. It's just built into us. Little kids are like that. They want to find out how things work, take things apart. I remember my son, when he was 2 years old, he took apart the little tone cartridge on my phonograph. He just sat there and meticulously took the thing off. How could I get angry at somebody who had the patience and inquisitiveness to figure out how this photograph worked? I mean, it's born in. Sometimes we tend to kill that curiosity in kids.
Galileo once said something like, one of the greatest thing God did in our known reality is to give us a brain, and what a crime it is for us not to use it. So, anyway, other things are, Pam,
Go ahead.
Having been a teacher and a mother of young children, I think one of the most wonderful ways we can start teaching children about God is to look at the world around us with wonder and awe. And, from the little kid who says, why is the sky blue? Or why is the water blue one day on Lake Michigan and another day it's gray? And you start by encouraging that sense of wonderment, and then you start adding facts as far as you know them to the level that they can understand them, and just keep that open. And then and when you reach a point, you say, I just wonder how that got to be so amazing. And I wonder what we still don't know about that. So I just think that wonderment and like Chell mentioned, inquisitiveness is what we encourage. And I think being open to how we don't know all the answers, and isn't that exciting that we might find out more as time goes on. I just love it. I taught science, and it was my favorite time to talk with the kids. So
that's beautifully said, Pam. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think we should conclude our session. And I just want to highlight again that on the 18th of October, Dr. Charles Franklin of the Marquette University Law School will share the latest polling trends for the state of Wisconsin. Jean Heffernan in November will have a special session on children with special needs. And Philip Chard will return to Christ Church on December the 6th to address ways that we can accommodate our life during the winter months of this pandemic. And now would you all put on your sound, please, and let's give Jim a big round of applause.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much.
Well done, Jim.
Thank you.
Well done. So valuable in many ways. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for
Thank
being
you
here.
so
Thank
much,
you for your
Jim.
questions.
Thank you.